The discussions, the expectations of this budget with economist Thabi Leoka. Thabi, a very good morning to you. And the last time we heard from the finance minister on this platform about the budget, last year this time the world was a very different place. A year later we are COVID struck, pandemic struck. We've got more problems than we ever imagined we would have. What are we expecting from this budget today? How different is this going to be from a year ago?
This is a very different budget and a very challenging one to put together. I can imagine, the big task that National Treasury had to go through to put this budget together. For starters, the mandate is to look at our debt and our ballooning debt. So the minister has to make sure that debt does not increase, but at the same time, he needs to ensure that we grow the economy. And typically, you would spend in order for us to grow the economy. But we need to be sure to also look at how we're spending and whether we're spending in the right places. And I think in the past, we haven't been doing so. We know that we've been spending a lot of money on state-owned entities that have been failing and not being not efficient, ESCOM being one example. And so we need to now focus our budget on areas, spend on areas that will generate economic growth.
So let's look at it in the COVID context, Thabi, and the pandemic context. And we know we've now got to find money for things like vaccinations. Increasing taxes would be one of those, but people seem to not be buying it because, as we just heard, from Kasauta, I'm not sure if you heard eNCA speaking to Matthew Parks there saying, but when you have wasted money and you've squandered our money, how do you then justify telling South Africans this has got to come out of your pocket to save your lives as well? People would have reached their limits. So he's got to think about that as well. We've got to think about saving lives in the country. We've got to think about those unemployment figures that came out yesterday as well. What will be the main, what should be the absolute main focuses, and also telling South Africans that they've got to sacrifice a little. How do you justify that?
Very difficult. He needs also to, I think the number one priority is to put a safety net. So to ensure that those who are poor and vulnerable, those who have lost their jobs, receive some level of safety net. This includes the informal sector and businesses. That is one thing that I'd prioritize. Last year, there was an announcement of the 200 billion credit guarantee scheme, and that was not successful. I think that we need to rethink it and so that we can support businesses and also South Africans who have been impacted negatively by this pandemic. I think that's number one. Number two, you cannot, I listened to Matthew Parks, and you can't save everyone because we only have limited resources. So we need to also, we will reduce certain allocations and programs to government. I looked at the budget, for instance, and there were certain departments that were, I think the allocation, about 60 to 70% of their allocation goes to salaries. And very little then is left to go about their implementing necessary programs, whether it's infrastructure, schools, roads, etc. So again, I think that we need to emphasize on allocating resources where it will generate growth, and it's very important to support the poor and vulnerable because ultimately we will have to pay for them in terms of either a larger increase of those who are dependent on social grants. And also there are lots of social issues that are attached to poverty and obviously inequality, and that's not what we're trying. We need to ensure that the inequality gap closes, and by doing so we need to provide the safety net that I'm talking about and to prevent social ills and all sorts of inequalities that will come out of this pandemic.
And of course, Thabi, the bigger plan, the big picture is to see how he's going to create inclusive economic growth and tackle these unemployment figures as well. I mean, how possibly, what would be your guess as to what he might have in that speech to show us that we can do this, that we can create inclusive economic growth, but also help create employment where every day now, also because of this pandemic, we see more and more people losing their jobs?
So the employment issue has been a long-standing issue in South Africa. It's a structural issue. We have many plans that look at reducing the unemployment rate. what we need to do is implement those and ensure that some of the plans are realized. It's not about, I'm not going to come up with another solution because we've come up with so many of them, and the problem is that we're not seeing the unemployment rate, a reduction in the unemployment rate. The other thing that's worrying is that the younger generation, youth unemployment is increasing, and it's now above 60%. So the youth needs to be targeted. I think we need to think about our education policy, and I think we definitely need to reform education, especially basic education, so that we equip those who come out with a matric certificate, so that they have choices other than just going to university. They can start their own jobs, they can go into apprenticeship. We need to also ensure that there's more private-public partnerships that will help with the labor absorption, and also perhaps even incentivize companies that are absorbing labor. So there are many creative ways that we can do this, and we're not having that discussion as a country. We tend to look at, let's say, university as a way of absorbing matriculants, and then hope that they get absorbed by the private sector. But the private sector can actually play a role in absorbing matriculants who don't necessarily want to go to university and may want to study whilst working.
Definitely time for a bit of a mindset shift there. Thanks so much. And that's our economic expert there, Thabi Leoka. Just to what we can expect, what the finance minister is actually dealing with, what he's actually had to work with, and what we could possibly hear in that budget speech at around 2 o'clock. Still to come.